Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Power of Our Story. We here at the Power of the Story are a place of safety for our protectors to process the journey together with others that get it. We are building a tribe in the gap where we are losing our protectors to hopelessness and suicide. We do this by storytelling as our stories connect us. You can reach out to us at the Power of Our Story and meet our amazing community that cares about you and understands. So please don't spend years suffering in silence. Tonight, we're going to welcome our guest, Anthony Powers. Anthony is an experienced, inclusive, and inspirational leader, helping people to forge positive futures and organizing people to work towards more equity in the justice system. At the young age of 16, Anthony was convicted of murder and sentenced to 77 years in prison and earned an early release at the age of 42. In prison, Anthony transformed his own life and spent years helping others to abandon their criminal lifestyle. He joined the Seattle Clemency Project to help people with their reentry from prison. Most recently, he founded the American Equity and Justice Program to make data more available and useful, helping decision makers understand the fairness of policy and sentencing decisions and ultimately improve equity in the justice system. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Anthony.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And just as a little side note, right? And I don't get into it as I go into the chronological order of my story, but when I went in, there was no parole, right? So when I had 77 years, it was just 77 years. But they came up with a U.S. Supreme Court decision that said, children are different. So people who got locked up while they were adolescents, then they should be reviewed to see if they still need to be in prison. So that's what ultimately that gave me the opportunity. But a lot of stuff that I was doing while I was incarcerated, which I'll get to shortly, a lot of that stuff was just because I believed in it, and I was doing it like years before that Supreme Court decision even came out, so it just paid off for me, right?
So
I was
that's
born,
amazing.
yeah. So I was born in Portland, Oregon. I was born into extreme poverty, but it was kind of strange when I grew up because I knew part of my family had money, and then my mom and her sister, and they refused to get help. So the house that I was born into was actually became one of the first crack houses in Portland. So that was the type of neighborhood I was in, the type of influences that were surrounding me, and the value system that you're taught in those environments is, the more crazy is, but it's not like mental health issues crazy. It's street crazy, right? The more crazy you is, the more value that has. So then you're taught that that's a good thing. If you're violent, that's a good thing. If you disrespect people, that's a good thing. You're taught all the wrong things, right? So it was learning those things and following that lifestyle with a lack of direction that ultimately, and I take full responsibility for what I did, but that's the culture that led me to make the decisions. But the odd thing to me is that even though I was surrounded by that and I was taught that, I would still I would still feel like an opposition to stuff, but I would still do it anyway because you want that acceptance and you want but I had a natural opposition. And when I started mentoring people later on, a lot of gang members, a lot of gang leaders, they told me the same thing, like, hey, and then they feel you feel trapped in that life. So it's understanding that life. When I first got released, I started mentoring youth before COVID broke out, and because I knew how to talk to them and I knew what they were thinking and what I saw too many common themes that if you really reached out to them in the right way and express those things, and a lot of people are feeling those same things. So when I was first incarcerated, I went to an adult prison that didn't separate juveniles back then. So I went to the Washington State Penitentiary that at one time had the record in the United States for the most murders in a 1 month period. So I went there, still underage. People see me now, I'm 6'2", 260 pounds, but back then I was 5'8", 130 pounds. So and got into my first fight, and then people came up to me, and it was a strange culture, right? It was a strange culture because it was like, if you fought for yourself, people will stand up for you. But if you didn't fight for yourself, then you're just raped and you're a victim. Right. And it's like, what kind of sense does this make? Right. But that I followed what I learned when I was first incarcerated. But then it was really when I started finding out about family members further back, right? Like I found out that my great grandfather was a professional baseball player in the Negro League. His daughter My great grandmother was she started off as a secretary at IBM, worked her way up to management, then wrote for 3 soap operas and all that. And I was like, man, she was a dark skinned Black woman in the 60s and 70s doing all this. And it just changed my mindset of what I thought was possible, right? So in 2004, after my best friend, and she was more like my sister growing up, and she was a square, she never got in trouble. She was murdered in a domestic violence incident. And it really brought home, I already felt guilty about what I did, but it really brought home to me, even though mine wasn't domestic violence, but it brought home to me what I did to somebody else's family members, right? So that year I pledged, and before that I got in a whole bunch of trouble in prison, but I pledged to never get in trouble again, and I never got in trouble again. It was a few years after that, because by that time I've been incarcerated about 15 years. And a lot of people respected me. So a guy came up to me, and I knew he's trying to get around his own moral compass. At least that's how I interpret it, right? Because he said, "Hey, I got this guy who's willing to bring in an ounce of meth, and I'll give you $500 if you give me permission to bring it in," right? And it was like, so I ended up talking to this guy for about an hour about how stupid of an idea this was. And he had been in prison for four times for the exact same thing. And I was like, "What happens every time you come to prison?" Right? He said, "I lose everything." I said, then what happens? You have to get out, you have to rebuild everything, and then you come back to prison, you lose everything, right? So I ended up talking to him for about an hour about how stupid this was, that he would even want to bring drugs into prison, right? So, but it really was a ha moment for me, that I was like, man, how we influence each other in here, we really need to change the culture of the prison system. And now afterwards, after having done it, I know that sounds very ambitious, and all the work, I had no idea. I thought it was just like be common sense, and people were like, "Oh yeah, that makes perfect sense," right? But I actually had to win over both the people who were incarcerated and the staff who were very skeptical of us, right? So I started off small, just to see if people agree with my ideas about, being a positive influence on each other, and actually how that would benefit us and benefit our families. Because even if we don't get out, if we encourage people to, maintain the criminal lifestyle, which was the culture of prison at the time in Washington State, if we continue to encourage each other to be criminals, then somebody might get out and victimize our family or our friends or anything. You don't know who they're going to victimize. And even if it isn't our family or our friends, it's somebody else's family or friends, right? So I was talking to different races, different groups, different gangs, and it was almost weird. It was like, because people would say the exact same thing. They would say, "Hey man, I agree with exactly what you're saying, but I can't let them guys know." They'd even do the same gesture, right? Because I pull them away from the group on the prison yard, the recreation yard. I pull them to the side, and they'd point to their own friends and say, "I agree with exactly what you're saying, but I can't let them guys know." So I started pulling other guys from the groups, and they would say the same thing. So I was like, okay, most people feel the same way, but we just have to make it socially acceptable to do this. So I started pulling people like groups of 3, small groups, right? And then they had Toastmasters. So I go up there, and then I became, I do my speeches. I do. I got elected vice president of education, so then I could mold what the flow of the meetings were going to be. So then I started, incorporating different things like that, and slowly but surely, start growing the influence of it, right? So then I went to the Chaplain Wakeman. He was at Stafford Creek Correction Center, and I ran the idea by him. And he was like, "Man," we ended up talking for like an hour and a half. And then he said, "Well, I think you should talk to Dawn Taylor, programs manager." So I talked to her about it. And she said, "What makes you think that you're going to be able to do this?" Right? I said, "I believe I can be able to do this." So, I had this big old game plan for it. And she shrunk it down. And because she said, they're never going to go for it. She's talking about the administration. So we started small, but I started with 12 guys. And with those 12 guys, we worked on stuff for a year. I wrote a curriculum that covered, getting to know yourself on a deeper level, getting to know your strengths, your positives, and how to maximize those, getting to know your weaknesses or your bad sides, and how to overcome those, how to build strong family ties from prison, how to develop a good work ethic, couple with incarceration, because as men, we don't talk about our emotions a lot of times, but you're going through it, and a lot of times that really hurts you, and that hurts those around you when you're not willing to express your emotions. So a couple with incarceration. And the 5th one was reentry. And being that I was 16 and I didn't know stuff, I had to ask a whole bunch of different people. One of my friends was actually a vet. That's one of the hidden things is, you talk about PTSD and trauma with vets. In a small prison system like Washington State, there was over 1,100 vets when I was there. So I mean, just people having difficulty dealing with what they went through on different levels. My cellmate, he was in Iraq. He got injured. He got addicted to pain pills. that led to drugs, and then he got locked up for that. So, but I leaned heavily on him, and then I'd ask other people and then compare notes, because I couldn't tell people how to get an apartment if I never got an apartment, right? So I had to, but I brought up this curriculum. The curriculum ended up becoming the most successful cognitive class in the Washington Department of Corrections. So then they allowed us to open it up a year later, and within a month and a half, we had around 450 people signed up for it. So they're like, "Yo, what is this?" So it had this split inside of the Department of Corrections, right? Because some staff were like, "Okay, I think this is a good thing," and then the other ones were like, "Oh, we're skeptical." And the prison investigators, they were doing stuff that was like, "Come on, man, you heard me out here, right?" Because they were snatching up gang leaders, and everybody who came out, like leaders of Serranos, leaders of BGGs, they were coming out and they're like, "Hey, I agree with what you're saying, bro, but I can't be going through this," because they were like cussing them out, like, "Hey, we know you're effing phonies. We know he ain't gonna change." But I think that was their way of testing them out, right? So then they wanted to come out and quit. I was like, "Nah, man, you can't quit." You know what I'm saying? We had to show that we're serious about this, right? So long story short, we ended up setting we had a graduation, and I put out a challenge to lower violence, to show that we have the ability to lower violence, right? And then in the next month, it set a record for the lowest violence ever in a Washington State prison. So then that was really a wake up call for the Department of Corrections that, hey, this is not only beneficial for the people who are incarcerated, this is also a benefit for the staff who have to work in these kind of places, right? So one of the things that I try to do, it's like just point out the humanity and try to build a bridge, So, there's so much of that us versus them, and we see it out here in society with politics and everything else you can imagine. So one of the things that I try to do is build a bridge. And I was like, if we have this us versus them, and everybody would say, "Oh, well, what about them?" I said, "Don't worry about them. Worry about our actions, right? If we have this us versus them mentality with the people who work inside of the prison, these are the people who we see most coming in from society, the same society we all say we want to get back to, right? So if we're opposed to the people we see most from society, then that's going to have some part of us being in opposition to society, or the people of society, because these are people who we seeing most coming in from the outside, right? So we really need to break that down. So, and then everybody would have an example of, well, what about so-and-so? He's always rude to us. I was like, all right, well, start saying good morning to him. Start treating him like a human being. You say he don't treat you like a human being, start treating him like a human being. And the social dynamics of the prison start changing. So then in 2013, Steve Sinclair, who later became the head of the prison system, he was the superintendent of Walla Walla, the state penitentiary. And that place was a madhouse, right? Just to give you an example of how bad that place was, people dreaded inmates coming from there. And the inmates who came from there were the ones who were good enough to get out of there, right? So that place was madhouse. So he called the prison that I was in, and he said, because by then redemption had started spreading to other prisons, they like send people to teach it in other places, and nobody wanted to go to Walla Walla. Everybody wanted to get out of Walla Walla. So he asked me if I voluntarily go from the place that I was, which was by then it was the best place in the prison system because we had turned it around, to the most violent, worst place in the prison system, voluntarily, not getting no money, putting my life on the line. There's people who are getting stabbed for supporting programs, and he wants me to come bring a program that says, let's abandon the criminal lifestyle, right? So I was like, hey, come on with it, right? So, but honestly speaking, if I didn't have life in prison, I might not have done it, right? Because I was like, what I have to lose, if I do get stabbed or they stomp me out or something else, it's like whatever. I died doing something I believed in. So I went there, and when I got there, I met with him, and he said, expect a riot or a staff assault, because we've had a major riot or staff assault once every 4 to 6 weeks for the last 6 years straight. And we just had one a couple of weeks ago. So we're expecting one in probably about 2 weeks to 2 to 4 weeks. And my response was, that's why you brought me here, was to put all that stuff to an end. I went there with a 3-point strategy. I won't get into all that, talk about some other stuff that I'm doing, but I can if you want me to, if anybody has questions afterwards. But long story short, I was there for a year. There are no more riots. There are no staff assaults. And it went from the most violent prison in the state to the least violent in the state within 5 months. So it shows you that, with the proper approach, you can change everything. With people, I've seen people who I was like, man, this dude is crazy. This dude is violent, but, with the proper approach, you can reach. I mean, I think some people like, serial killers and all that, but most people, most human beings, you can reach people, right? It takes the proper approach. It takes time. It takes effort, it takes energy, but with the proper approach, you can reach most individuals. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't be accountable for their actions. I believe that I should have been accountable for my action. I believe 26 years for a 16-year-old. I mean, that's 10 years longer than I lived outside of prison. And I say that having been, like I said, my best friend, but also my nephew. My nephew got murdered because there were some people who saw him and thought he had money because of the clothes he was wearing and went to rob him and ended up murdering him when he froze up. So even with them, if they turn their lives around, I don't want them to just get out immediately. But if they turn their lives around and they did an adequate amount of time to where they had a balance of punishment and another opportunity of life, if they turn their lives around, then I would be okay after a certain amount of time with them, being able to return to society. I'd rather them be out here paying taxes than me paying taxes to keep them in there if they, were adequately punished and turn their lives around as well. That's just my view. So that's what I mainly did inside of the prison system. After I was released, everybody says I hit the ground running. So I started a consultant business, made some good contracts there, flipped a house, made double the money within 2 years, bought another house, and then did the stuff I did here. We did a project a few years ago with the city of Seattle where I was a project manager. Just doing a study on how to reduce crime and improve community. Of course, the city council didn't do nothing with it, but at least we did it, and we actually had some really good stuff, right? Because I'm not one of the people who like you have a lot of people that say get rid of the police, but you need the police. Like who you're gonna call somebody breaks into your house, right? I mean, you have to be practical, right? I mean, you have to be practical, right? So really coming up with practical solutions that really benefit society and benefit all of us. So, but then I built out the statewide reentry system for the Seattle Clemson project. They actually hired me to answer phone calls and do online resumes, and then I built out a statewide reentry system that we were told in the meeting with the governor's office about a year and a half ago that it become the premier reentry system for Washington State. A lot of different nonprofits actually use some of the techniques that I created for that. And then I built out the American Equity Database with Microsoft. That started off as a hackathon. We've done 3 hackathons, but in first place twice. It's the biggest hackathon in the world. But it's to help legal practitioners, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and to really just have a view into their own practices and have some fairness, just using data to see past our own biases, and have a more complete and better system. And that was after I read a stack of studies. I had the idea when I was in prison, but nobody wanted to listen to me when I was in there. But when I got out, I was able to pitch it to Microsoft, and we got it off the ground, and now we're working on building that out nationally. And yeah, I'm open to questions.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That is amazing, especially knowing that you started on this journey so young. So I commend you for taking the time to stay dedicated to learning what needed to be done to make this successful. And I think the data itself proves that you have been extremely successful with all of these. So thank you for that. Mandy, did you have a question?
I did, and it's really weird that I happen to be on tonight and that you're on tonight. And I first want to ask you, do you know Gerald Hankerson?
Yeah.
Gerald, just for everybody else, Gerald was a 19-year-old gentleman that was had a life sentence, was committed like death sentence actually, and he served 22 years in Seattle, and the governor commuted his sentence. Do you work with him? Or
no, not personally though. Yeah.
Okay, but
yeah,
because I've worked with a lot of people with reentry, and when another part of my life that has nothing to do with what I talk about, but just so weird. I was thinking about him because when I ran for mayor at a certain time in my life of the city I live in, and him and his, I would call him a posse of his group, were very supportive of me because I live in an urban city, and he was just a wonderful guy. And I have a nephew, not by blood, but I call my nephew, that just was released from jail after 3 years. He was 18 when he went in, and since he was 18 and there was the other kids were underage, he was the only one that got any sentence. He just got out of 3 years and has we have no idea what to do with him, because, he's not following. He's already violated parole. He's got a bracelet on because he's got to be a big shot, and you come
Yeah,
back in.
I'm
I
gonna
don't know
put
what to advise him.
put my email in the chat. Matter of
Thank
fact,
you.
I'll put my phone number in the chat.
Thank you.
I'll talk to him.
Because and unfortunately, his mother, this is a sad story, guys. His mother is serving 30 years for murdering his father in front of him when he was 3 years old. So if anyone, you know, had the shit served to him on a platter early on, and family that tried to step in. But I'm going to reach out to you, and I appreciate you because of your story and for sharing it. And thank you. If you put that in the chat, I'd appreciate
Yeah,
it.
I actually I put a 29 instead of 206. 29. It's 206. The second
Okay.
one. But Mandy, I think you have a really important point too, is it really comes down to us being willing to understand somebody's backstory, right? One thing I didn't say when I was starting off, when I was talking about childhood, I suffered severe physical and verbal abuse on top of the environment that I lived in, right? So, but a lot of people who are incarcerated, when you hear their backstories, it's like, man, we were doing this class, and I won't say any names, right? But there was this big old biker, like you see him, and he's like, he had like 2 life sentences and 100-something years, and it's like he killed a couple people, tried to kill a couple other people, but it was like, you think this dude's a monster, right? But then he like introduces himself, he starts sweating profusely, and he's like, start talking about how he's molested when he was little and everything else, right? But then you look at his crime, and his crime was he was selling drugs, biker. He goes to this house for a drug deal, and he sees these people live streaming child porn, like victimizing these kids. So he pulls out these guns, shoots everybody, you know what I mean? And gets all that time. But I mean, you look at the backstory, it's like, not to say, that justifies the crime, right? Taking the law into our own hands, but you could understand it. I mean, I can understand anybody doing that, but especially somebody experiencing something like that, going through the trauma. And I saw, like, because this is before I knew, all that, and I saw like how he responded when he talked about a childhood. And this is a big old, just tough dude, right? But he was like sweating profusely, bawling, crying. Then he came to me afterwards and said, look, man, this class is too much. I say, hey, I was just asking you to say your name, bro. But he's just like, I think that was also his time to get it out. He held it in all that time. And, that was his time to, express it.
I thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Carrie, go ahead.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing your story, brother. I've been working with DOC personnel, and that's quite a challenge. One of the guys recently shared that when he got hired, they asked him 3 questions. The warden said, "Will you be on time? Will you do what I say, and will you kill somebody if I tell you to?" And he said that was basically it for the interview. And and so I realized that there needs to be like a kind of a reform, from the inside out. And I would just wanted to know, like, how you said you're ambitious, but what is your thoughts on really, transforming and reforming our judicial or prison or inmate system?
Our system started changing when they saw the value in it, and they saw, like, well, actually, maybe we've been doing things wrong, right? Because it was very similar, and there was a lot of staff. Before I saw management changing, I had a lot of staff coming to me when they saw the stuff that I was doing on the ground, and a lot of staff were saying, "Look, when I came in here," and they told me a ton of stories. Their dad was incarcerated, their brothers were incarcerated, their friends from high school were incarcerated, and they came to work there wanting to make a difference, and then they saw the culture there, and they're like, oh, well, I guess I'll get a paycheck out of it, right? But a lot of people, they go there wanting to do the right thing, right? And once we get that acknowledged, because every state is different, right? But once we get that acknowledged and just get that out in the open, then I think it'd be easier to bridge that gap and say, this is what we can actually do. to make the community safer. Just having somebody in prison doesn't make the community safer. I'll give you an example of that, right? There's a guy I met on his 4th time incarcerated. And his first time incarcerated was for a nonviolent crime, but how prison was, the culture of prison, he was influenced and he finally just gave up, joined a gang. The city he was from didn't have gangs, Centralia. The gang he joined was from Yakima. According to the DEA, 100% of drugs come from the Sinaloa cartel in Yakima, right? So it's like, it's a drug hub. Him got out, started that gang in Centralia, opened up the drug group from Yakima, right? And then I know the guy, I was locked up with the guys who brought the drugs from Yakima to Hoquiam to Aberdeen. It affected 3 cities, how one person was negatively impacted in prison. And then he came to me on his 4th time. He's like, man, I wish you would have mentored me, because I didn't know him on his 1st time. Because I wish you would have mentored me my 1st time, because now I can't undo all this crap I did. You know, and he really felt bad about the negative influence that he had. He's like, what can I do? I said, there's really nothing you can do to undo that, except for live your best life. And, you know, saying, don't put too much pressure on yourself. Just live your best life, be the best influence you can be. But it's like, look how important it is to make a difference. And I think if we can get people who are working inside of prisons to realize their impact and realize that public safety goes beyond just making sure somebody doesn't go over the fence, but how you treat somebody like a human being so they get in touch with their humanity on a deeper level. I think that, you know, that and, you know, real life examples, I'm hoping would work in other states like it did in Washington.
No, it sounds great. You know, the thing is, I'd like to maybe connect with you, some of the people out of Kansas and Missouri. You know, Missouri just did their training, you know, for everybody. And it was, I think your story is kind of, you know, compelling and it helped them kind of think outside of the box. And I know, you know, Department of Corrections is so challenging. You know, I lead this retreat for Warriors Ascent, and about half of the DOC employees, after they go back, resign because they realize, like, you know, this is so toxic, this is so unhealthy, and they really don't have control. And, you know, it's triggering for them, right? When they put on the uniform and they go back into the prison system. So it'd be awesome if maybe you and I can kind of collaborate to connect with some people in Kansas and people in Missouri to shed some light and some opportunity to help really transform and save more lives.
I'm definitely happy to do that.
Thanks, Carrie.
Yeah, thank you.
Chaplain Todd, go ahead.
Anthony, thank you. What an amazing story. You and I were talking before we got started about me growing up, cop's kid. My grandfather was a cop as well, and I talked about the term looking at the world through cop-colored glasses. And you know, as a firefighter, you get that effect as well. You're not exactly, for the most part, dealing with, you know, people at their best moments, and a lot of times you're dealing with the aftermath of people doing some, you know, pretty inhumane things to other people. You know, dealing with a child that's been severely beaten, or, you know, the result of somebody shooting into a crowd, or a gang shooting, or, you know, pulling somebody out of a car that's been killed by a drunk driver. And I know my dad and my grandfather and me, you don't have time to think about somebody's backstory. You don't have time to you know, to think about what it is that brought them into a particular situation and made them act the way they did. And so you tend to just paint them all with a pretty broad brush. And I know that, you know, my dad had some pretty hair-raising stories. 28 years with the King County Sheriff's Department, and another 8 with the Washington State Attorney General's office, dealing with predatory sex offenders. And so you kind of cubbyhole everybody that gets incarcerated, and you end up sticking them with the same label. And you don't take time, you don't have time to really, delve into their background or think about what brought them to where they were, because you're on to the next call. You're on to the next result of somebody's inhumanity to another person. So I just want to say, what you've talked about and the work that you're doing, I think it's so vital, because obviously we can't put everybody away forever.
Yeah.
At some point, these people that have obviously, at some point made a terrible decision in their lives and ended up incarcerated, they're gonna come out of that at some point, and they're gonna come back into society, and we have to decide, are we just gonna warehouse them for that period of time,
Mhm.
or are we gonna make an attempt at trying to change the direction of their lives, and hopefully they can make better decisions when they come out, and we don't exactly set these people up for success when they come out. I mean, I can't even imagine what it must be like for a convicted felon to come out of prison and try to make a life for themselves, even if they've decided that they're going to make a change in their life. It's got to be extraordinarily difficult to just even get that process started, to get a decent job with that on your record. So I really want to commend you for doing what you're doing. When Christ sat down and he had dinner, and the Pharisees were looking at him, their comment was, well, why is he sitting and eating with sinners, with prostitutes, and with tax collectors? They were the most hated people in the society in Israel at that point. And Christ said, well, people who are well don't go see a doctor. I'm not here for those people. And I think that what you're doing is absolutely commendable, and I just think it's a absolutely wonderful thing. So thank you.
I really appreciate that. And another thing is that, like, I heard a lot of guys who are incarcerated. So, like, you don't have time to look at everybody's backstory, right? But a lot of guys who changed, they had a story of somebody along the way who showed, like somebody in authority who showed kindness to them, or said something like, hey, man, you're better than this, or something, and it's like they didn't change right away, but, it stuck with them that entire time, Me and my little sister, she was born on my 4th birthday. It's her birthday tomorrow. We went to our old childhood home the other day, right? And we saw this tree, and I was like, hey, man, remember that tree? And because the tree, I jumped over it when I was a little kid, and I broke it, and I took some tape and I like taped up the trunk, right? So you could actually still see it, but now it's a huge tree, but you can see the trunk where it had been split and then, came together. It's like, but you plant that seed, plant the seed, bro. You never know when it's gonna bloom, So, just, bearing in mind, you might not be able to look back in the past, you might not have time for that, but you plant that seed and could have impact later on down the line.
Amen.
Thank you, Todd. Chris Gregorio.
Anthony, thank you for sharing. I've got 2 questions, and they're probably a little different than most folks. A lot of this group, as we talked about, is a lot of PTSD dealing and stuff like that. You talked about culture change.
Mhm.
Being an institutionalized guy who spent most of your life in prison, that's a pretty admirable thing to be able to change a culture and normalize, was the word you used, and I love that, to be able to talk about those things and to deal with those things. From your perspective and your journey that you went through, albeit I can't even imagine what it is and how much of a struggle that could have been. How would you suppose that, or how did you change that culture to where people were able to do that and participate in these programs and be a little bit more vulnerable so that they could change? Second question is, I know that convicts get obviously a very bad reputation when they get out. From your perspective, for the common man and woman out here, what would you do, or what would you change that to change perceptions so that there's a stronger chance at successful reintegration? Because everything's relational, right? About having relationships,
Yeah.
and it's hard to get past that barrier with that, in your background to have opportunity. What would you change? Obviously it's got to be one person at a time, between your convicts interactions, and obviously you can't speak for everybody, but as well as the rest of society to what can we do to try to stifle off that perception, and to give a chance, to give a shot.
Yeah. Good questions. The first one, it was a gradual process as far as changing the culture, because the culture happened over decades, right? So I mean, it didn't change overnight. But one of the things that I did was just getting the men in there to be willing to be accountable. We know the right thing, right? We know the right thing. So it's coming together and then building that vision of, hey, we're working on this as a movement, right? This is not just a class. This is us working towards an objective. And when you have guys who are told everything to do and they feel like their life is meaningless, and you feel like a loser. You might not have too many people admit that. You're in prison, you feel like a loser, right? So you feel like you actually have purpose, then it's easier for you to move toward that collective purpose, rather than, you're not just changing for yourself, you're changing for everybody who's part of that movement. You feel like it's important. So it's really selling them the idea that, we're moving towards something meaningful. We are meaningful, our lives are meaningful. And then also to have that accountability to where, part of it was, hey, if you see somebody not doing the right thing, pull them up, because we can't allow that to be a negative reflection on us. So, to have that accountability and that sense of movement, that was the two biggest things that led to the culture shift in there, right? And then knowing, actually having that be part of the culture, that the mission, saying changing the cultures of prisons. So, and then out here, I think something that would be helpful out here for society. I was actually, I went into tech sales when I first got released, right? Something I didn't say when I first started, right? I had some of the best numbers in the country for that store that I worked for, right? And they said 7 years, no criminal, no felony in 7 years. And then they did a further background check, and they still fired me. Even though I was killing it, I was living in a small town at the time. I was making $1,000 to $2,000 an hour in sales, and their highest ticket item was $450. You know what I mean? And they still fired me. So so when it comes to the society piece, I believe not giving people preference, but to giving people opportunities. Most people get out that I've worked with. I've worked with a lot of people who have been released from prison. Most people who get out, they want to do the right thing, at least initially. So if you can get them initially, it'll set the trajectory in most cases, right? So if they're barred from getting a job, they're barred from this, barred from that, then they're like, hey man, what's the point? Then they're more likely to go back to a life of crime, right? So to break down some of the barriers truly, because they say, you have a lot of fair chance jobs, or they call themselves something, right? Fair hiring jobs or second chance jobs, but a lot of them I know have laid people off when they find out they have a criminal record, right? So just to be honest and really give people an opportunity to acclimate back into society, who really want to be a part of society, and give them that chance to do so, right? And to really remember that when it comes to all of us, there's a stigma with prison, right? So I mean, I know some people in my family didn't talk about how they had me in family, or had a family member who was incarcerated, right? And I remember I was in a meeting with some people from the governor's office about 3 years ago, so right. And I was talking about how Washington State had over 500,000 convicted felons, and we only have 7 million people in the state. So most people know somebody who's either convicted of a felony or they have a family member, right? And half the room was like, yeah, half my crazes. And you know what I'm saying? They talk about their family members who are incarcerated, dealing with crime and everything else, right? So, a lot of us don't even talk about that. So if we could break down the stigma, of not thinking that, if you have a family member who's incarcerated or something, or a friend who has been incarcerated, if we could break down that stigma and just say, hey, look, this is something that has hit most families in America, then at least it would open up some conversations, in my opinion, to where we could say, okay, we know this is an issue. If we can get people folded back into the folds of society, then maybe we won't have so many people returning to prison. You're still going to have some people who are dirtbags. You still have people who are going to go back to a life of crime. But
do you think that there's a legislative process possibly that could help that and also protect the businesses while giving folks in your position that second chance?
Yeah, there's already protections for businesses. I mean, you got they can get bonded through the federal government for like up to $25,000. I mean, so that's a pretty good protection by itself, right? And with the, I think legislatively they'd have to have accountability. If they say, you can't go back more than 7 years, then you have to. There has to be some teeth to it, right? So I mean, if there's no punishment to it, it's just like crime on the streets. When I saw, they weren't arresting people for stealing, and they weren't arresting people for whatever, some of the stupid stuff they're doing a couple years ago. If there's no accountability, then it just makes things worse. So I think when it comes to second chance legislation, so to speak, then there has to be some kind of teeth. There has to be some kind of punishment or something, that people violate the process.
Thank you, Anthony. I really appreciate your courage and your vulnerability to come on here and share so deeply. I think it's very impactful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Anthony, again, for sharing your story. And I stated, I work for the Department of Corrections now, but I'm not a CO, never been a CO, don't ever want to be a CO. But my background has pretty much been law enforcement, either in the military or federal. So I'm the one arresting people. But I started in victim services, and I just have a question for you. Did you ever participate or ever think about participating in any of the restorative justice programs? I know Washington is pretty big on the restorative justice programs where they bring together the offender with the survivors of violent crime.
Yeah, and I've done everything that I can when it comes to that. But in Washington State, you have a lifetime no contact, right? So even I had my victim, a family member of my victim, reach out to me and say, "Hey," and this is recently, right? Say, "Hey, I forgive you. I'm glad you're out. I'm glad you're doing all the good that you're doing." And I couldn't even respond and say thank you. You know what I mean? Because how the laws are written, it says you can't even third party. So I couldn't even post it on Facebook like, "Hey, got your message," and it's like, I think that's a disservice to the victims. Because, I don't know, she might be thinking that I'm just like shunned her off, like,
Right.
And that's not the case. I'm grateful. That's meaningful to me, So, I've done everything I can, but
and I think if you do, and if you want to, because I helped build the victim offender dialogue here in Arizona, and I conducted several dialogues bringing the offenders together with the survivors.
Yeah.
And part of it is that stigma and just treating people like human beings. And I don't think I ever felt that I treated, people I arrested or I had to handcuff or whatever, or even possibly get physical with as anything other than an offender.
Yeah.
But during my time doing the victim offender dialogue, the majority of my cases were homicide or like child molestation. And I'm the father of a survivor of child molestation, and I'm sitting across the table from sex offenders, child molesters. And, people ask me that know my story, and some of the people on this call know it, how could you sit across from a child molester knowing that my daughter was the victim? And I had to tell them, it's not about me, it's about the survivor, first of all, but it's also about that inmate, that incarcerated individual, and helping them. And I would tell them that I don't see them as an offender. I don't see them wearing an orange jumpsuit. I see them as another human being. And not everybody's built that way, especially those of us sometimes in the criminal justice system. But you're starting to see a shift now towards that restorative justice. But I think if you wanted to, you could reach out to the Washington DOC victim services and let them know, because I think they have a letter bank program.
I've done that. Yeah.
Yeah, and you could do that, and and there's other. I know some people over there in the Washington DOC, but yeah, part of it's that stigma. Just like people stigmatize us that wear the badge, and paint us with a broad brush. Society paints the incarcerated with a broad brush, and they're just a criminal. They did a horrible crime, And some people did do horrible crimes, but they're still a human being. And I think that's part of it. So
Yeah.
again, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and here, the victim has to reach out to them to say they want to do the in-person thing, but they don't tell them about it. So they have to find out about it on their own, and they have to do it in order for you to get the.
Yeah, and that's a shame, because I know when we started, I was out there, I was yelling it to the masses, saying, hey, we got this new program. If you're a survivor, talk to me and we'll
It's
see
so
what we can
much-
do.
From what I've heard from the people who've done it, it brings so much healing. And
Oh, absolutely.
yeah,
It's a very profound, and
yeah.
Everybody involved, it's you as a facilitator, the offender, and the survivor, and we all have our own Kleenex. Everybody's crying, laughing, hugging. It's all good.
Yeah.
So again, maybe offline we could talk and see if
All right.
we can help you do something there.
Thanks, Daniel. Paul, go ahead. It's still muted, Paul. There you
My
go.
question, thank you. My question has to deal with the internalization of this process for people. And that generally, although not always, relates to the emotions that they are feeling or have felt or what have you. And so I'm wondering if there is any particular set of emotions that you deal with or approach or discuss or anything along that line.
In regards to
The people that you work with in the prisons.
oh yeah, I don't think I really understand the question 100%.
I'm sorry.
I don't think I understand your question 100%. Is there particular
Okay.
that
Let me try to reframe it. Maybe this will make
apologize.
more sense. When you're dealing with people who have experienced rejection,
Yeah.
anger, fear, and the list goes on, or you have dealt with people who have experienced joy and happiness and love and kindness. Those are 4 or 5 of positive and negative emotions. And I'm just wondering if part of your program in dealing with the inmates considers that or has anything to say about it.
The dynamics of the different experiences that we have.
I'm sorry.
You talking about the different dynamics of like the different dynamics that we all come with our own experiences in life and the different dynamics that we all come to the table with, right? If I'm understanding you correctly. One of the things, I told you about the workbook that I created, and you had the exercises that went along each week with that, right? I think that's one of the things that really built bridges with people with different life experiences, because because we share answers, right? And when you saw people answering similar to you, but they might be a rival gang member, they might be a different race, they might be a different religion, then it really just showed at the core of it, regardless of if we grew up in the suburbs, we grew up in poor neighborhoods, if we grew up wherever, and regardless of your race, your religion, your background, we saw a lot of us had the same or very similar answers, and it really built a lot of bridges that led to friendships and even further conversations and understanding outside of the classrooms.
Well, one of the things that it seems to me might be helpful, and perhaps you're already doing it, is getting people to understand that regardless of their race, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of the language they speak, regardless of the accent, skin color, any of that, we all deep down have the same desires for betterment.
Yeah.
And if not for yourself, then for your family.
Exactly.
And so that, I guess that's part of what I'm asking here is
I think it's one of the reasons why we're so successful is because people at the core really do want that. I mean, I saw really heroic, in my opinion, very heroic. I think I give you a bunch of examples, but this one was like really heroic to me. There's a guy who was born in El Salvador in a village, right? So his uncle was in the military when they had the Civil War. So he was a child soldier. They gave him a M16 when he was 10 and told him to go fight, right? Right after that, they had a bunch of people who were deported from America who were gang members. So MS-13 went down there from, predominantly California. They recruited him when he was a teenager. His mom, who was a villager, sent him to the United States. We used to laugh about this, right? She sent him to Los Angeles to get him away from the gangs in El Salvador.
wrong city.
Yeah. So
I used to work in Los Angeles. I know about that.
Yeah. So he ends up in prison. There were some rival gang members that he thought he was gonna fight, and then they pulled out guns, and then he pulled out his gun, shot all three. They all lived, but he got 60-something years, right? And but he was a gang leader of the Sureños in there, right? So he joined Redemption. It was so the group I called was called the Redemption Project, and the reason I called it Redemption was because I believe that we needed to acknowledge the crimes that we did, and our way of redeeming ourselves with society was to encourage people to abandon the criminal lifestyle. So if they got out and didn't victimize people, we can't go back and change the past of what we did. But if we prevent people from doing stuff in the future, that's our way of redeeming ourselves with society, right? So I called it the Redemption Project. So he joined, and then he changed so much. He got up because we used to do these like workshops, like assemblies, right? He got up in front of 200 something guys at the prison and said, "I'm done with my gang. I'm done with this Peter Pan lifestyle. I know you guys are probably gonna try to come kill me, but whatever," And it was like that was a huge, huge moment, And of course they threatened to kill him, and they put him in another prison in protective custody. But it was a huge moment. He knew what was going to happen. He knew he was either going to get snatched up or he's going to get killed. But he was like, "Look, I'm done being a negative influence, and I'm done with being a poison." He's like, "It's time for all of us to grow up." And I thought that was a brave thing that he did.
And think about that and his mother's motives, if you will.
Yeah.
And he wound up becoming a leader.
Yeah.
Of MS-13.
Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah.
Mara Salvatrucha.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Sure, you're welcome.
Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, Anthony, what an amazing story. I think it just moves my heart how you have done this. How you have been able to take a tough upbringing and reframe it so powerfully in how you can actually help empower people to be their best selves. Like I feel emotional. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. It's amazing. I am so for you. I have just a list of things that I would love to comment on, but I can't because there's too many. But one thing I do also want to highlight in your talk is I feel like one of your superpowers is just your manner. You are so incredibly gracious. And you are somebody that I feel like has such a powerful voice because you're not name calling, you're not dividing, but you are inviting us all. You are surrounded by law enforcement and correctional officers and we are having this amazing conversation and we're all with you, I really just pray for all the success in your work. There's definitely a couple people that I really want to introduce you to. And I hope, and this is probably another big conversation, but I hope that, and I don't know how this works, but you're doing something so pure and I don't want the government coming in and messing it up.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like, you're
Yeah.
doing it right. You are
Yeah.
doing it right. You know, let's help these people that want to help, that want to change and are willing, and they want to hear your voice and your mentoring, you know. So I wish you the very best with the connections with the right people, and that nobody suppresses your powerful voice, that for political gain and whichever angle it comes from, you know. So thank you. You're amazing.
Thanks, Sarah. And Janet.
I want to just acknowledge what everybody else has said, Anthony. The one common denominator in all of this, with all of us here and with all the people you work with, is there really were born without any judgments. But there is a trauma that happens, no matter what somebody might judge, little or whatever, it's the impact that we feel at the time that might be minor to somebody else, but is impactful all the way around. And you're a gift. Like, we all have gifts, but we don't all speak about them, or we don't all acknowledge them. And we're blessed with the people who surround us, and we have a common denominator, all of us here, and it is to help others. And by sharing our story, and it's not always easy to share that story and acknowledge what's happened. But I want to commend you on that. And this is a tribe that supports you as well. So I'm behind you, and very good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
What you were hearing, Anthony, was the distance over the Atlantic Ocean.
Okay.
Thanks, Janet. Mandy, go ahead.
I want to just say thank you to Anthony, and for your encouragement. And I am going to reach out to you. And like Sarah said, your demeanor just, it made me want to listen and hear what you had to say. And which is a big part of, you know, hearing someone's story, if they're engaging and honest and from your heart. And so I just want to let you know, being around both ends of the coin from different perspectives, and I really appreciate you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Anthony, I knew this was going to be a great conversation. And so I'm really excited that you came on and talked with us. We hope to have you back again. You're welcome to join us anytime. But thank you for everything you're doing. I think at the end of the day, the biggest thing I took away from your story was, doesn't matter if you're talking to an inmate, the president of the United States, your neighbor, everybody is human. And you have to remember that. And those humans come with stories, and those stories deeply impact their life. So thank you for that reminder, and thank you for everything that you do.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for all the work that you do.